Hello and welcome to Real Opinions, and this is the second part in my Halloween horror recommendation series. For those who don't know, what I'm going to be doing is going every day, I'm going to be reviewing a different horror game, each one appealing to a different kind of audience. Maybe it's a different genre, maybe it's from a different period, maybe it's in a different style, but the idea is to find a horror game that works for you, that could get you in the mood for Halloween. So, part 2, we're looking at Alan Wake, which is a very, very different game to Outlast. Indeed, if Outlast is a little too hardcore for you, then Remedy Entertainment's interesting fusion of horror TV and literature might be more up your street. Unlike the last game that we talked about, Alan Wake is actually rather tame. The jump scares are mild and infrequent, the violence is largely implied, and the enemies that you encounter are lacking in menace. This is horror intended for the faint-hearted, that's for sure, but that doesn't mean that there's no value in it whatsoever. What this game lacks in intensity, it more than makes up for in sheer style and narrative intrigue. Channeling David Lynch crossed with the Twilight Zone, this is a dreamlike and surreal supernatural thriller with a palpable atmosphere and effective central mystery. Released in 2010 to critical acclaim, Alan Wake is a postmodern celebration of everything that its creators hold dear. From Twin Peaks, to The Shining, to The Birds, to Salem's Lot, The Mist, Blue Velvet, all of these works are either name-checked directly in dialogue, or at least referenced or homaged. The resulting game is an amalgamation of a variety of influences from mystery television to horror novels and cult cinema, but it still feels like a cohesive whole in and of itself. Indeed, Alan Wake is certainly one of the most singular games out there, with a very distinct tone and identity that makes it feel unlike anything else out there. From its striking visuals to its utterly bonkers plot and its eclectic soundtrack, it's a totally unique experience and one that I thoroughly recommend. The game's narrative is concerned with the eponymous novelist who is vacationing with his wife at the small town of Bright Springs. As Wake himself points out, it's the type of place that you'd assume was extinct, the kind where everyone knows each other and old queer superstitions are still held in high regard. It is a place that Wake is quick to disparage. We almost immediately come to resent him, by the way. He's antisocial, impatient, stuck up, and has quite the temperament. Most of his angst seems to stem from the fact that he's been suffering from writer's block for several years now, causing him to lash out at his friends and his devoted spouse, named Alice. When he discovers that Alice has actually arranged the whole getaway as a ruse in order to convince him to meet a local therapist who specializes in treating struggling artists, Alan loses control and storms out of the cabin that they've rented. Whilst he is cooling off, he hears her scream, a blood-curdling scream for help. He subsequently rushes back inside to find his wife, only to see her sinking into a nearby lake. Alan promptly dives into the water in an attempt to save her, but passes out in the dark and murky depths. He then wakes up in his car, unsure of exactly what has happened or where his wife is. He travels into the imposing, fog-drenched forest in search of help, whereupon things get very weird. Alan soon discovers that the strange, shadowy creatures lurk in the woods, and that a supernatural force is controlling his every move. The plot thickens even more when Alan comes across an unfinished manuscript for a novel that he supposedly worked on but doesn't recall writing. Said manuscript seems to have a prophetic quality, as every word written on the page describes upcoming events with startling accuracy. The weird stuff doesn't stop there either, as Alan soon realizes that an entire week has gone by since Alice was missing, even though it only just happened. And then things get even more convoluted and weird, and there's a floating man in a diver's suit, and there's local crazies, and light plays an important part with Christmas lights, kind of like Stranger Things. It's so mental and so weird and so complicated, and I love it. From there, it's just so convoluted, but it's very deliberately woven, and it involves, like I said, it involves other realities and kind of time distortion. I'm not making any of this up, and condensing this narrative into a brief summary, as you can tell, is nearly impossible, which is why it's good, I think, that the game is structured the way it is. It's structured in episodes rather than levels, so there's 6 episodes to the game, and each one introduces new elements and twists, so that just when you think you've got a handle on what's going on, a new spanner will be thrown into the works, leaving you utterly bewildered. Say what you want, but you can't fault the ambition of the storytelling here. It's reminiscent of early era Lost, or like I said, Stranger Things is maybe a decent call to, because you're thoroughly confused and you're hooked at the exact same time. You'll find yourself blasting through the game real fast just to get answers and see where it's all heading. And if you pay close enough attention, you might actually understand what's going on. Because what's unique about this mystery, when you compare it to, say, a film or television one, is that the amount of information you receive is totally dependent upon you as a player. Vital clues and pieces of exposition are hidden in the forms of these elusive manuscript pages from the book that Alan's supposedly written, and it makes the tedious task of hunting for collectibles actually really engaging, because you want the information in these pages because they fill in the blanks that the narrative doesn't tell you about. If you interact with certain characters during the exploratory sections of the game, they might elaborate further upon some things, and of course replaying levels is almost a necessity in order for you to get the full picture of what's going on. How much of Alan Wake remains unexplained is basically down to how you play, but either way you have to work with it if you want a complete sense of the whole thing. Like Donnie Darko, it doesn't hold your hand or spell things out for you, and even when you have all the cards on the table, certain things are still left open to interpretation. It makes for a compelling storyline, and one that is told in a unique way, as I said, with the whole episodes gimmick. It wasn't released episodically, it was released as a full product, and this might seem like an odd creative decision, but it works. Each installment has its own specific focus and objective, as well as a key theme at its center, and the division into episodes helps to structure the story in a clear-cut way, and I especially like the way that each episode ends with a really nail-biting cliffhanger. The previously on segments also help to provide some kind of orientation when you're confused about what's going on. The episodic structure thus works for Alan Wake, even if it might initially seem like a showy, stylistic choice that serves no purpose. Indeed, there are plenty of unusual things about Alan Wake that could be there for weird's sake, but actually have a specific function. Take Night Springs, for example. This is a black and white sci-fi show that exists within the world of the game. Whilst playing, you can find TVs that are playing reruns of this Twilight Zone parody, and then watch the whole thing. So this is a TV show within the game that you just stop playing in the middle of the horror narrative just to watch this show. Does nothing in terms of narrative relevance. It doesn't tell you anything about what's going on. There's no explicit connection between Night Springs and the events occurring in the main game. However, it's a fun little addition, and moreover, there is a purpose. Each episode's thematic content in some way correlates to what's going on in Alan Wake's story. We have episodes dealing with other universes, dreams, ancient gods, creators who can rewrite reality, and people coming to terms with the fact that they are nothing but characters in someone else's story. All of these weird things are common themes shared between Night Springs and Alan Wake, and the former does a good job of exploring them in further depth. It just means that you get these interesting ideas, and there's even more ways of looking at them because you have the show's version as well as the actual games. I think it's a great way of just exploring these things in greater depth because there's so many ideas in this game, and I think that it uses all of these kind of collectibles and optional things to expand upon them. The unconventional choices don't stop there. There are sequences of this horror game where you do nothing but walk around talking to characters in broad daylight. Like, what was that? Elsewhere, there's this distinctive use of licensed music, which brings together various genres, periods, and styles to form a very, very diverse collection of songs. The only thing that seems to unify the musical choices here is that all of the songs are seemingly kind of pop or rock tracks that are upbeat, but they have a weirdly haunting quality. There's a Roy Orbison song in here called In Dreams, which it plays in Blue Velvet, and it has this really sorrowful, creepy, almost operatic quality, and it fits the game just like a glove. There aren't many horror games that use, compilation soundtracks, which is understandable because it shouldn't work, but this it does. It works fantastically. Even something as straightforward as combat is a little bit different in Alan Wake. Here, your supernatural foes are impervious to bullets and other form of damage, unless they are exposed to light. This makes encounters far more creative, as Alan must use everything from flares, car headlights, torches, and the environment itself to fend off the dark forces at play. And it makes so many unique set pieces and moments. There's like a part where you have to stay underneath a helicopter spotlight in order to remain unharmed, or there's a bit where you take advantage of an old rock concert setup so that you can blast away the hordes of enemies with fireworks and things. And I'm just thinking, can you think of another game that so brilliantly merges an aesthetic element, which in this case is lighting, and then merges it with the gameplay mechanics? Normally lighting is just something there for atmosphere's sake, but here it's actually a tactical thing. You see a stream of light and you go, yes, I need that, that's useful to me. Of course, Alan Wake isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. If it were, I wouldn't need to be recommending it to you in the first place, you'd have already played it. Unfortunately, there are some areas in which the game, mainly in design terms, really lets the overall product down. Strangely enough, for a game that takes so many risks, it's actually the more conventional aspects of gameplay that it seems to struggle with. For example, shooting and driving both feel awkward and clunky, which is frustrating when so much of your time requires you to be doing both of these things. Similarly, things get very repetitive after a while, and the initial novelty of the whole light combat mechanics start to wear off after the 200th time that you're ambushed. They just ambush you all the time. You walk into a street, it's a big empty place, and then someone jumps down behind you, someone jumps down to the left, and you're surrounded by them, and it stops meaning anything after a while. It's just business as usual. It also feels like the story itself can't maintain its sense of mystery throughout, as the second half of the game starts to become a bit more conventional, and the dreamlike tone of the earlier sequences is lost in favor of something much more schlocky. I definitely think there is a tonal shift around episode 5, at which point everything weird and special about Alan Wake starts to lose its sheen. It's the point where I think Stephen King and David Lynch weirdness are traded in for generic survival horror tropes. I don't know, I can't explain it. It's the first half of the game is so weird, so unlike anything else, and then the second half of the game feels a bit more like Resident Evil or other horror games. There's also the thing that for a horror game, this one's not really that scary, which is I'm gonna come back to in my recommendation. But don't get me wrong, it has atmosphere. But I've played first-person shooters that are a lot more scary than this, to be honest. Alan Wake is a glorious experiment that deserves more attention than it gets. And whilst it might fumble in the gameplay department from time to time, it has so much personality and does so many interesting, daring, and unique things. Almost all of them pay off. It's weird that this game kind of fumbles at shooting and driving, but does all these other things so well. It's so weird that it can't do the normal things right. It has a great narrative though, top quality world building, and a distinctive style, and it might not be the scariest game out there, but I do think it is one of the best horror games out there. Not the scariest, but one of the best. So, recommendation. For those of a more nervous disposition, Alan Wake is an engaging psychological thriller with a fascinating story at its core. 8 out of 10. Thank you, and if you enjoyed this, stick around because there'll be another one on the way soon.